author event this Sunday afternoon, May 22nd. This program is another in our series that's representing biographies. And we're delighted this week to have with us David Reynolds. He's a professor at CUNY in New York, and he has come here today to talk to us about his new book, John Brown, Abolitionist. He calls this book a cultural biography, and he will talk to us for about 25 minutes about the book, and then he'll be willing to answer questions and sign copies of the book. If you have copies, they can be signed, or there are copies for purchase at the store also. David Reynolds.
Thank you. Very nice to be here in Concord. Actually, Concord plays a pretty large role in my book because I try to make a pretty strong case for Emerson, Thoreau, Alcott, and others who live in Concord as being very, very deeply involved in bringing the attention, the nation's attention to John Brown. And I'll describe that a little bit later on. Now, most of you are probably aware that John Brown was the only abolitionist who really repeatedly took up arms against slavery before the Civil War, and he's known for three main things. During the period of Bleeding Kansas, as it was called, in 1856, he directed the slaughter of 5 pro-slavery settlers on Potawatomi Creek in Kansas, and dragged them out of their beds at midnight and slaughtered them with swords. And then 2 years later, he led 20 men into the slave state of Missouri, right next door to Kansas, and liberated 11 slaves, killing one white master in the process, and then trekking with the blacks 1,200 miles halfway across the nation to Detroit, where they took a boat to Canada and to freedom. And then, most famously, his boldest move was the raid on Harpers Ferry, Virginia. Now it's West Virginia, with 21 men in an effort to liberate slaves in the area and then flee with them to the nearby mountains, with the idea of using this long mountain chain that ran into the south as kind of a base from which to make attacks on plantations and create a state of terror throughout the South, and hopefully the South would be forced to compromise. What happened, though, is they stalled too long at Harpers Ferry, and he did liberate many slaves in the area, but stalled too long, was captured by Robert E. Lee. He was imprisoned, he was brought to trial, found guilty on 3 counts, and then he was hanged on December 2nd, 1859. Now, in my so-called cultural biography, what I try to do is recreate the contexts. I'm very interested in sort of, I think all of us are either consciously or unconsciously shaped by the images we see, the culture in which we live, the moment in which we live. And so whether I'm dealing with Melville, Walt Whitman, or in this case John Brown, I try to recreate their culture as completely as possible. And now, he dated his hatred of slavery from the time he was 12, when he saw a slave boy that he befriended, a very intelligent a young boy, being beaten with a shovel, and this incident, and driven outdoors, an incident that made him swear eternal war against slavery, as he wrote. So from a very young age, hatred of slavery flamed in the core of his being, but we can ask really why. After all, slave boys and girls and their parents were being beaten, and they were driven outside every day, and nobody seemed to have his extreme reaction. What was it about him that provoked this extraordinary revulsion? I try to show in my book that it was the unusual brand of religion that his family espoused. He was born in 1800 during the first period, the early part of the Republican period, not too long after the Constitution was ratified. And the Constitution, of course, separated church and state in America. And when this occurred, Protestantism was sent diversifying in many different directions, as different individuals gave their own interpretations, and in some cases started new churches. There were some very creative, sometimes even shocking practices that emerged under the name of Protestantism at that time. In Oneida, New York, the so-called Protestant perfectionists under John Humphrey Noyes practiced complex marriage, whereby each woman had many husbands. Sounds pretty complex to me. Anyway, and then on the opposite side of the coin, the Mormons, of course, which was formed around this time, instituted polygamy. And the leader, Brigham Young, reportedly had 52 wives. And then there were the Shakers, who were actually pretty important in New England, in this area, and they practiced celibacy. And then there were the Millerites, who gathered on the hillsides in white robes, waiting for the end of the world, as prophesied in the Bible. And they were out there in October 1844, and the end didn't come then, so they were out there in October 1845. And anyway, and actually, that sort of also gave rise to the Seventh-day Adventism. And there were a lot of these kind of 19th century, very, very creative interpretations. And as creative as all of these, really, I don't think none was as creative as the religion that took hold in the family of Owen and Ruth Brown, John Brown's parents. Now, this family religion was never spelled out as such in the early going, but it was always acted upon. And when something like this, I happen to be Caucasian. I happen to be a Calvinist Protestant. They were very rigid Calvinists. You're black, you're Native American, you're Asian, another ethnicity, or perhaps you're Catholic or Jewish or atheist. That doesn't matter in the relationship I have with you. All that matters is mutual respect of each other's social rights. Nothing else counts. And for the Browns, this unspoken creed has special meaning for their feelings about the millions of enslaved blacks in America. As you know, there were nearly 4 million enslaved blacks by the time of the Civil War. Now, John Brown always said that his abolitionism was rooted in two things: the Golden Rule and the Declaration of Independence. But again, that really doesn't tell us much, because there was nothing intrinsically anti-slavery about either of these. There are many Southerners who were very, very ardent Christians who used the Golden Rule to defend slavery. They said that they were doing blacks a huge favor by bringing them to America, exposing them to the so-called blessings of Christian civilization. And the guy that became the vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, actually said we should take over Africa and enslave its millions for the same reason. That was his version of the Golden Rule, to spread Christianity to Africa. And as for the Declaration of Independence, its author, of course, Thomas Jefferson, had inherited 300 slaves, and there were many, many Southerners who venerated the Declaration. So when John Brown said that, it really doesn't tell us too much. So really, his interpretation of the Golden Rule and the Declaration were, for their day, just as odd, really, as the complex marriage and all of that stuff. And maybe in a strange, even odder. Even though with the wisdom of hindsight, it might seem kind of obvious to us and so forth, but it was, it really has to be viewed as something very, very quirky for its period. And for our period, it's actually very prophetic. It looks to, I mean, in a way, I see John Brown as being, on the one hand, someone as conservative as the most right-wing Christian today, evangelical Christian, but as most radical, as radical as the most radical person alive today. And these things kind of coming together and creating incredible, explosive combination. I mean, his favorite theologian was Jonathan Edwards, who was, there was no one known as conservative theologically as Jonathan Edwards, who probably whoever lived, no Protestant, he was extreme Calvinist, but that kind of very conservative Protestantism with this, as I say, very quirky for its day, a social radicalism, just was so explosive. And as a result, he was distinguished by an absence of racism. Ironically, many of the other anti-slavery figures of his day, as noble as I think many of them were tinged with racism. Lincoln thought that blacks and whites couldn't live on equal terms because of what he regarded as being the essential differences between the races. And for a long time, he advocated colonization or shipping emancipated blacks abroad to places like Liberia or Central America. And another anti-slavery figure, the scientist Louis Agassiz, claimed that a typical black, again, these were all anti-slavery figures. Forget about what the pro-slavery figures felt. Agassiz claimed that a typical black person had the brain of an undeveloped white fetus, while the anti-slavery politician Cassius Clay, no relative to Muhammad Ali, declared that the natural place for blacks was in the tropical sun eating bananas. And these were among the most vigorous anti-slavery figures of their day. For John Brown, in contrast, openness to people of different ethnicities was in his blood. As a boy growing up in the Ohio wilderness, he befriended Native American children in the woods. He was initiated into a tribe and learned the Native American language. And later, when he was a farmer in Pennsylvania, a white neighbor came to him and complained about the Indians in the area. And he asked Brown if he'd join him in taking guns to drive the Indians off the property. And Brown told him, "I will have nothing to do with so mean an act. I would sooner take my gun and help drive you out of the country." So, it kind of, shows his racial openness. And not that he was the only one who had this kind of racial vision. Particularly the Quakers of that day tended to be non-racist and so forth. But he actually he chose to live among blacks, to work with them. He sought their advice. He admitted them to his home and his dinner table, and not just the well-known ones. He was very close to Frederick Douglass. He thought Harriet Tubman was kind of the greatest person alive. But he also chose to live among very obscure blacks in the colony of North Elba in upstate New York, near Lake Placid. And one famous white visitor to North Elba, the novelist Richard Henry Dana, 2 years before the mask, was absolutely shocked. And again, he was anti-slavery as well, but he was shocked when Brown had several of the local blacks sit alongside him and the other whites at the dinner table, and integrated them into the conversation. Not only that, but addressed each of them by Mr. and Mrs., and just treated them with absolute equality. And Brown's military plans also stemmed largely from blacks, particularly the slave revolts in the American South. He was very inspired by Nat Turner and by the Maroons in Haiti, and Toussaint Louverture, who had led the revolt against white European domination in Haiti. Also Cinque of Amistad fame. He was very, very inspired by Cinque. It's true that his sympathy for the downtrodden emerged partly from his own status as a struggling businessman who rarely made it above the poverty line. Few people in history who have had an impact have failed so miserably. He failed as a tanner, a shepherd, a cattle trader, a horse breeder, a lumber dealer, a real estate speculator, and a wool distributor. Why all these failures? Well, he had to provide for his growing family. He had a total of 20 children by 2 wives. Although, that sounds like a lot, but back then it was very common for a family to have 8 or 9 kids, and he had 2 wives. And actually, one reason why they did have large families is they knew that a certain number were going to die off. And in fact, he lost 4 kids at once to a disease that nowadays doesn't really even exist. So I'm just saying that it was very common, and only 8 children actually survived him. So the average kind of worked out in the end. But he did have this growing family, and but he was clumsy as a business person. He was clumsy. He was bullheaded. He knew his good wool from his bad wool, and so he would set his good wool at a very high price and his bad wool at a low price, and he wouldn't change with the marketplace. I mean, and nowadays, then as now, you have to be a little bit supply and demand, and he just wouldn't go along with the market. And he also entered business at just the wrong time, 1837, which was the first year of the worst depression in American history before the Great Depression. And actually a lot of the land that he owned, that he invested in at that time, would have made him hundreds of thousands of dollars if he'd been able to survive that 5-year depression. But anyway, he went bankrupt, and partly the victim of timing, really. Anyway, in the 1850s, he became violent about slavery because he saw slavery was becoming increasingly entrenched as a result of several laws: the Fugitive Slave Law, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision. And in the South, slavery was increasingly being seen not as something, sort of a bad thing that we just had to tolerate, In Jefferson's day, it had been that, Jefferson said, well, it's not a very good thing, but we have to tolerate it. But actually, by the 1850s, it was seen as now a positive good, as John C. Calhoun said. It was a good thing. It was good for whites, it was good for blacks. It was a noble institution that must be spread. And so it was ideologically entrenched. And in the North, there was a lot of anti-slavery feeling, but very little action. The leading abolitionists, William Lloyd Garrison and Wendell Phillips, were pacifists who thought the slavery problem could be solved by dividing the nation. They were also disunionists, so they went to divide the nation and allow the South to go its own way. Lincoln and then eventually slavery would sort of fall off the vine like a rotten apple. Lincoln and the Republicans hated slavery as much as John Brown, but they loved the American Union, and therefore they hated the idea of war. 2 years before the war, Lincoln actually said war is not the answer. He said slavery will slowly disappear on its own, although he thought it might take a century. So he thought that maybe by 1958, maybe slavery would be gone. Now, John Brown thought otherwise. He was driven to a fury by what he thought was the North's cowardly response to pro-slavery violence. He was appalled that people were flocking to Kansas from the neighboring slave state of Missouri, were taking off over the Kansas polling booths, and they were electing fraudulent pro-slavery legislatures in Kansas. And not only were these pro-slavery governments being elected by complete fraud, but they were being supported by the central administration of the United States as being legitimate. President Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan. So this is a pretty outrageous situation. And there was a lot of violence against anti-slavery people. His violence is not put into context enough, because my research shows that there were many, many deaths in battles, but of the murders, the 38 political murders committed in Kansas between 1855 and 1858, 28 of them were committed by the pro-slavery people. And only 8, I say only, obviously no murder is good, but relatively you can say only 8 by the anti-slavery side, and John Brown was responsible for 5 of those 8 murders. And also John Brown thought that violence was justified by the centuries of cruelties to blacks. He defined slavery as a state of war. For him, slavery was a state of war, and he was taking retaliation against the institution of slavery. So even if someone said, John Brown, you've committed a crime, he said, yeah, but it was a war crime. He was also giving the South some of its own medicine. He was getting back for decades of unavenged violence committed by Southern whites against slaves, against free blacks, and visiting Northerners who were suspected of abolitionism. Recent studies of violence have shown that over 80% of the acts of vigilante violence by Southern whites went unpunished. The code of the chivalric Southern gentleman was laced with machismo and aggression. The South was a culture of dueling, bowie knives, and deadly feuds. No one thought the less of Southern President Andrew Jackson on our $20 bill because he killed a man in a duel and he threatened to kill several others. Mark Twain parodied Southern violence in his portrait in Huckleberry Finn of the family feud between the Shepherdsons and the Grangerfords. You might recall how Huck learns about the feud. Buck Grangerford tells him, "A feud is this way: a man has a quarrel with another man and kills him. Then that other man's brother kills him. Then the other brothers on both sides, they go for one another. Then the cousins chip in. And by everybody's killed off, and there ain't no more feud." And it was in response to several such acts of pro-slavery violence that John Brown committed his retaliatory crime at Potawatomi. As a contemporary journalist shrewdly noted, quote, "John Brown has brought violent Southern tactics to the northern side," end quote. And in a sense, his violence paid off because the South developed a panic about him that grew with his later violent actions. When in 1858 he liberated those 11 slaves in Missouri and marched with them across the country, 1,200 miles, the daring escapade was performed in the face of the whole nation. The Kansas governor put $3,000 on his head. President James Buchanan added $250, prompting Brown's quip that he'd gladly pay $2.50 for the head of James Buchanan. But, Brown said, "It's perfectly well understood that I'm not going to be taken." And, he sort of pursued the whole way, but they kind of kept away from him. Anyway, Now, many have called him crazy for thinking that he could uproot the slave system by attacking the South with just 21 men. Recent events, however, suggest that his plan was more feasible than was long thought. His plan was to make a quick strike, rally hundreds of blacks to his side, then flee with them to the mountains which ran deep to the south. He wanted to scatter small groups of blacks and whites, somewhat like today's terrorist cells, along the Appalachian chain, using this terrain, which he knew well. He knew the mountains. He'd been a surveyor, among many other failed jobs. Using these mountains as a defense against pursuing forces. He was a very close student of guerrilla warfare. He thought he could evade vastly superior forces by using caves and other natural defenses in the mountains. And as we know, the success of such a strategy by the Afghan guerrillas against the huge Soviet army, and then more recently by Osama bin Laden against the U.S. military, suggests that this wasn't necessarily a crack-brained scheme. He miscalculated, though, by expecting an immediate massive response on the part of the liberated blacks. He thought, as he put it, quote, the bees would hide, that all the blacks would suddenly be like Nat Turner's revolt, they would all just explode. But the slaves in the area were unprepared. They didn't respond the way he had expected. Disappointed by the lackluster response of the unprepared blacks, he stalled fatally, and he was captured. And really, it's this delay that doomed his effort, since it gave time for the Virginia militia and the U.S. Marines under Robert E. Lee to organize and capture him and his men. I don't think we should be shocked by that either, because if you or I had been enslaved for years and years and years, and suddenly a white person appears at midnight, it'd be like a Martian coming in here. And some of them did fight with him, but slave revolts, and there were 250 of them, had to kind of burn from within, like the Nat Turner revolt, and suddenly whoosh, and it couldn't be kind of imposed from without. John Brown had this idealistic thing. If he just lit the match, the whole thing would it just happened. He was a little bit temporarily disillusioned, and he stalled. Ironically, the South praised him much more than the North at the beginning. They felt they had nothing to lose. Why? Because they said, finally, this is a Northerner who is willing to stand up, who has a little guts. As I said, they had this machismo down there and so forth, and they had the aggressive Southern violence. Obviously, they detested him in terms of his political views, obviously, but in the early going, it was his captors who praised him, Virginia Governor Wise and so forth, because he was so indomitable and so strong and all of that. And John Wilkes Booth was at his hanging and called John Brown the grandest man of the century. Again, detested everything about him, but loved his guts, his character, because this was like the Southern gentleman. This is the way the brave acted. And the only people in the North who said anything good about him were the people right here in Concord. And it's really Concord, in this sense, that kind of caused the Civil War. Usually the Concord people are considered, Emerson and Thoreau, are not even mentioned in Civil War histories. Not even mentioned in passing. In my view, if it hadn't been for Emerson and Thoreau, I think in Concord, I should say Thoreau, right?
Yes.
Thoreau. I'm sorry, Thoreau. Terrible. I'm embarrassed. Anyway. Then he wouldn't have been discovered. Actually, he shouldn't have lived through the raid anyway, because he was stabbed 6 times. I'm talking about John Brown, but the guy, Israel Green, the lieutenant who impaled him in the gut, had picked up his dress saber that day instead of his military sword. So it wasn't exactly rubber or something, but it was, didn't wound him enough, and also stabbed him in the head. But anyway, but all the northern newspapers said this guy was nuts. He's crazy. We don't support John Brown. We hate him. We hate John Brown. He's nothing. And then Thoreau said, I want the Concord town hall, please. And the Concord people said, no, thank you. No, you're not going to do it. He said, and so he went and rang the Concord bell there, and he gave his plea for Captain John Brown, which is a very, very powerful and total glorification of John Brown. And Thoreau said John Brown cannot be tried by his peers because his peers do not exist. His peers do not exist, and he just went on and on and on. And then Emerson, 2 weeks later in Boston, said John Brown, when he's hanged, will make the gallows as glorious as the cross. And there were so many millions of Americans who saw the American Revolution through his eyes, because Emerson had said the shot heard round the world in his poem in his Concord hymn, his poem about the Concord Bridge. And even today, a lot of Americans see the American Revolution through his eyes, the shot heard around the world. And suddenly, this new phrase, the gallows glorious as the cross, was itself like a ricocheting bullet that shot throughout American culture. And even though Emerson, very few people in America were transcendentalists. Very, very few, just a tiny, insignificant nothing. But Emerson was this figure, this cultural, when he spoke, people listened. There's almost no one like him today. Nobody agreed with him, but he was the leading intellectual of the day, and when he spoke, and suddenly the South said, "Whoa, let's not praise John Brown anymore. They're calling him Jesus Christ up there." And suddenly, a lot of people in the North slowly said, "Hey, if Ralph Waldo Emerson is saying this, maybe there's something to this John Brown." And very slowly, this huge tidal shift occurred, so that by the time of John Brown's hanging, which is about a month and a half after his capture, there was incredible polarization between the North and the South. Incredible polarization. And the Emersonian view of John Brown eventually swept the North, and John Brown became the guiding spirit of the Civil War for the North. Lincoln said, "I don't want to raid the South." Lincoln didn't want war, and at the beginning of the war, he was willing to put in an amendment to the Constitution, making slavery permanent where it already existed. He didn't want it to spread, because he didn't want war. And he said to raid the South would be like a John Brown raid on a tremendous scale. He used those words. It'd be like a John Brown raid on a tremendous scale. But obviously, he was sucked in to war by the bombing on Fort Sumter. He had to call up 75,000 troops. And pretty soon, the most popular song of the Civil War was "John Brown's Body Lies a-Moldering in the Grave." How many people have heard that one? Even kids nowadays. I was surprised. I was out in Kansas, an 8-year-old kid knew that. I couldn't believe it. But it's still somewhat known. Obviously, it went through many versions. Initially, it was not a song about John Brown whatsoever. It started out as a joke, ironically, in the cradle of secession in South Carolina. "Say, Hummers, will you meet us?" "Say, Hummers, will you meet us?" And then it became "Say, Brothers, will you meet us?" And Methodist hymn. And then the Massachusetts 12th Regiment outside of Boston was drilling, and there was a guy named John Brown, had nothing to do with John Brown, and he was late, and they kind of started teasing this poor guy. They said, "You're dead, you're John," and then they sang "John Brown's body lies moldering in the grave," and they said, "Hey, this sounds like the real John Brown." And within 2 days, that John Brown was singing it just as loudly as anybody else. And pretty soon it became the most popular song of the Civil War for the North, and eventually morphed into the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Julia Ward Howe heard it, and then she wrote Battle Hymn of the Republic, "Glory, Glory, Hallelujah," and all that. And the only regiment that didn't sing it anymore, however, was the Massachusetts 12th. It was a little too painful for them, because that John Brown, their John Brown, died early in the war, so they just refused to. It was just too painful for them to sing it anymore. At any rate. Why isn't John Brown better known nowadays? Just in conclusion, his reputation peaked during Reconstruction, but then at the end of Reconstruction, 1876, began that long period of Jim Crow, Ku Klux Klan. I consider it, as many people consider it, a very, very dark period in American history until 1954, Brown v. Board began that slow emergence in civil rights. And then, but in that period, John Brown was cast aside by the historians. The only people that really kept him alive were African Americans like W.E.B. Du Bois and Langston Hughes and a few others. But so he was just called crazy, paranoid, and all this stuff. And I hope that my book recovers him a little bit, and at least brings him back into the dialogue, puts him back into history books a little more. He's being featured more and more. There's that novel called Gilead, in which he's mentioned, and there was a PBS special on him a couple of years ago. And I hope to really help bring him back to the fore. But he's still very controversial. And a few years back, when Trent Lott was the head of the Senate. There was a senator from Kansas who wanted to something like a John Brown Day or some memorial for John Brown, and Trent Lott said, "Over my dead body." So it wasn't quite right then. Maybe my book will do something. Anyway, I have a whole section of the book comparing him to modern terrorists like McVeigh. McVeigh made a hero of him, as did Paul Hill, the abortion doctor killer, and so forth. And so I have a whole section comparing him to the modern terrorists. But I think that he's a lot different than a modern terrorist, because Bin Laden sounds almost exactly like John Brown in some respects, because he uses the same language. He says, Bin Laden says, "I was predestined from all eternity to do my jihad against the West." John Brown said, "I was predestined since all eternity to fight slavery." But there was a big difference. Some of John Brown's closest followers were Jews. Most of them were agnostics, spiritualists, free thinkers, atheists, liberal Christians. He was about the most conservative Orthodox Christian. Imagine Bin Laden. Bin Laden's view is there should be this country in which radical Islam is not only is in power, but all other views are excluded. And if God forbid Bin Laden were ever in power, it would be a new kind of Hitler situation. John Brown is just the opposite, and he was just as religious as Bin Laden is or pretends to be. But his view, he was what I call an American terrorist, if you want to call him terrorist. Some people would rather call him a revolutionary. American, because in my view, America stands for toleration of people, for all people, for all. I mean, ideally, we've never reached that ideal, but ideally, that's what we stand for. And the same with McVeigh. I mean, he can say I'm following John Brown, but shortly before he died, what did McVeigh write when he was in prison? He copied down a poem called Invictus, and that's a poem, an anarchist poem about myself against the world. It's me against the world. And what did John Brown write shortly before he died? His letters were full of references to enslaved blacks. He wasn't thinking about me against the world. He was, in fact, he said, someone said on the way to the gallows, "Don't you want a minister?" At the end, he said, "No, get me the most ragged black mother that you can find and the most oppressed black children. I want them to accompany me to the gallows." McVeigh didn't say anything like that. It was just me against the world, this kind of macho thing. So, I think that John Brown can be misused in a lot of ways. Anyway, I have time for some questions if you like. Yes.
As a civil rights lawyer from Ohio, I've always revered John Brown. I knew the real deal. So I was just surfing the other day and I saw your and it was I was in NPR that I saw that. So,
Oh, right, NPR, yeah.
But then I look at what's going on. I feel kind of also as a part Native American that I've been made complicitous against my own people, even being black, but that's
Okay.
another matter. But I make the point on my website in a 15-minute movie that the vestiges of slavery are still yea and verily upon us. And I have a cousin that works for J.P. Morgan, and they just had this settlement recently for actions that were done 100 years ago involving slave trade. But I'm wondering, against that backdrop, I was fired by a company up here and labeled a dangerous black man after I demanded overtime, which is also there. But I'm just wondering, against that backdrop, what do you think about reparations? And then,
Well, Emerson, who was not known to be a social radical on the day of the Emancipation Proclamation, basically he read something in public called the Boston Hymn, in which he said that blacks basically should be not only freed but should be paid reparations. It's been a long time. It's a very tricky kind of thing. I mean, I think that we're a lot further along than they were in John Brown's day towards some kind of social rights, but we still have a long way to go. Whether reparations is the way to go, I mean, in a way, I suppose it might open a huge legal can of worms. So, but certainly, I'm totally supportive of any kind of opening up and to equality social equality. And if it takes reparations, then I mean, I feel about the same way about Native Americans and about Holocaust victims and people that have been truly. And I happen to be married to an Armenian, and her her family was pretty much wiped out in Armenia, and so and they were at the time very wealthy, and it was just they were completely wiped out and all that. So yeah, I mean, it's a huge, difficult whole question of reparations. But and I'm not a lawyer myself, so I don't really know the legal end of it. But
Nor do we.
Yeah, I know. It's such a complex kind of thing. Yeah.
What was the reaction to Thoreau's essay on John Brown? Because it's a very powerful essay. What was the contemporary reaction to that?
Well, a lot of people sort of snickered at him because he was known as kind of the hermit of Concord, and even William Lloyd Garrison, who was very anti-slavery, wrote something in The Liberator saying, "We noticed that the hermit of Concord has come out of his shell," and made this statement. And if you read the Thoreau's journals, basically everything that in that speech that he gave at the Concord Town Hall, is it still called the Town Hall or something else?
Townhouse.
Townhouse now. Yeah. Anyway, was all from his journals. And what's really unusual about Thoreau is that he would write in his journals like about bumblebees or something, and then he'd have a paragraph about John Brown. Then he'd go back to the mosquitoes and the thing, and he'd write a few pages on the Walden Water and this John Brown. And you think of Thoreau and those people as being so into nature that they weren't, but really for them there was something sort of thinking about nature didn't preclude also thinking about what was going on in the world around them. And so when he came out, he gave that speech 4 different times, and it was printed in several newspapers. So he got circulation in newspapers, but it wasn't really until Emerson came out with that Boston statement that this whole thing really exploded. This whole transcendentalist, because Thoreau didn't really have the kind of clout at that time. Emerson really had huge clout in his presence, his cultural presence. But I think it was really Thoreau who sort of converted Emerson, because Emerson at first said, "Oh, this is a dreary affair" and so forth. But then when his good friend Thoreau came out and said this, then he really, and then Alcott, joined as well. Alcott wanted to go to Harpers Ferry and lead an expedition to free John Brown from jail, from prison. Yeah, you had. Okay.
Yeah. I have 2 brief questions. First of all, I haven't read your book, but I know that when Brown went to Kansas, he identified himself, his occupation as he was a surveyor, and I read this wonderful non-fiction novel for Truman Capote. It came up with the idea in 1952, written by a gentleman named Truman Nelson. It was called The Surveyor.
Right.
And I believe the guess that, if I remember correctly, that Brown had an awful lot of opposition against, I guess, what people called the liberals in those days, the progressives, especially Jim Lane.
Yeah.
He advocated, look, you're not going to talk to these people. You're not going to win at the ballot box. Even if you win, they're going to come after you. We ought to fight back. Did you find that, number one, that he was that aggressive, especially with more progressive types like Lane, and really wasn't progressive, but and the second, in the mid-1960s, the CIA contracted Isaac Asimov to do psychological profiles of certain characters of history, and Brown was one of the first, I believe, that he did, and he was, Asimov said, well, this gentleman, this Brown was a loser, and the winner would be somebody like, an object of pity was also a loser, rather, would be King George III, because he lost an empire. He's an object of pity, and Brown, which is not worthy of, pity. Did you have
Well, there's even a forthcoming essay in a volume about John Brown that calls him manic depressive, and he's been called everything from from bipolar to paranoid schizophrenic and all that. So he's been put on the psychoanalyst couch for a long time. I don't really see any. The only time I ever saw him depressed was, but I think everyone in this room, I know I would be very, very depressed and probably suicidal if I did lose 4 kids in 2 weeks. And at that, and right after then he says, I feel like dying. And as I say, I think I would write a letter saying I feel like dying too. I mean, these were very beloved children, particularly the oldest two, one was 6 and one was 4, and then there was an infant, and then there was one that was 2. So, of course, he had a lot of other children as well, but still, it was very painful. So, and I think at that moment, but that was long before Harpers Ferry. I mean, that was. But I've read every letter that he ever left behind, and I kept looking for signs of insanity, and usually signs of insanity, both in his day and our day, are mood swings, loss of sleep, anxiety. I'm talking about extreme of all of these, obviously, delusions, whatever, But he always remained very, very rational in his letters, and he slept like a baby when he was in prison. He never lost a moment's sleep. He kind of strolled to the gallows. He was the calmest person at his own hanging. Everybody else was kind of nervous, and he was very calm about it. And the night before, his wife came and visited him and said, "You have to cheer up a little bit." The next day was going to be hanged from the neck, even when he was severely wounded, I mentioned that he'd been stabbed by the rubber sword, but he was wounded enough that he couldn't stand up during his whole trial. So for a month he was lying down. I mean, he was pretty badly. They all assumed he was dying, but even then, and he hadn't slept for 2.5 days. He was interrogated for 3 hours by these pro-slavery people, by about 25 people, and he just kind of lay there and answered their questions very calmly and rationally. And Thoreau said that he didn't win anything with his rifles; he won with his words. And his prison letters, which were reprinted throughout the world, because the reason they were reprinted, he was visited. Unlike Saddam Hussein, where we don't know on a day-to-day basis what he's saying or thinking, but back then the prisons were porous. The reporters could go in and the pro-slavery people said, "Let's publish all his things because he's so obviously ridiculous. He believes in the equality of blacks and whites," and on and on. And anyway, but those words were published throughout the world because of these pro-slavery reporters. And Thoreau said he defined standard English. But if you ever read a sentence, you would flunk him in English 101 because he never wrote a grammatical sentence. And he told Thoreau, he says, "I know about him as much grammar as one of your calves, as a cow, But it was just the power of his language. And Emerson said that the Gettysburg Address was no better than his speech to the Virginia court. There were only two good American speeches: John Brown's speech to the Virginia court and the Gettysburg Address. And then this was Emerson. So I don't see him as crazy. As far as your other thing, I mean, he wanted to take it to them in Kansas because he was very frustrated. All the other Free State people, there were Free State, which were anti-slavery. Yeah, they were Free State, but they were also anti-black. They didn't want slavery, but that was part of their Constitution. They wanted to free all slaves and then kick the blacks out. So I'm saying the Free State people weren't that much better than the pro-slavery people. And he was really the only one around who was really thinking about integrating blacks and whites in Kansas and throughout America. So although I mean he was hoping it would happen with the ballot rather than the bullet, but there were several violent things that kept building up, and he exploded in rage at that point. Yes.
Well, when I was in Brooklyn College, part of community now, I had took a survey course on Reconstruction with John Hope Franklin, and he gave us a lecture on that. He thought that John Brown, even though he knew, Franklin thought that he'd never, be able to accomplish this, but just, because the blacks were not going to rise up, they were too beaten down at that time. That this meant, with just that one action, just sort of roused up everything else. And was that the view also of, did any of the abolitionists pick up that also in that way?
The reason I say that, I call him the man who killed slavery, sparked the Civil War. The reason I say that is that he created this incredible polarization between and a certain unity in the North and South. And suddenly the Southerners, a lot of whom exploited the John Brown raid to demonize the North, suddenly they became much more unified for secession. It's really secession that created the Civil War, but the secession movement itself was much aided by the whole Brown's Harpers Ferry
He thought his refuge.
situation. So I try to argue in my book that if Harpers Ferry hadn't happened, it would be still a very combustible situation, but maybe the Civil War would have been delayed because Lincoln didn't want war particularly. So maybe it would have been delayed. But I also try to argue that in a way it was better if it happened when it did, because if it happened later, I mean, as it was, the South people forget the South almost won the war a couple of times.
Right.
So anyway, but the North won the war. So, I mean, maybe the South would have won the war later, and then what would happen? And I think it would have been an even worse bloodbath if it had happened later, because there'd be more people and more weapons and all that stuff. So, yeah.
I have two different questions. I took a tour of Harpers Ferry a few years ago, and the guide emphasized the religious element of Brown's crusade at Harpers Ferry. His sort of, and that some of the flaws in the plan and the planning, sort of not quite being aware of some of the loose ends, and that Brown sort of fell back on the expectation that God would take care of all the details, that God was on his side, and that God would awaken the slaves in the fields to his rebellion, and that they would all go and find him in the mountains. And but when I heard you speaking, it sounded like when you were talking about the plan, it sounded like you were emphasizing more the rationality of the plan and the rationality of the execution of the plan. So I was curious what you make of his how much religion was affecting his thinking about the execution of the plan. And then my second question is more just sort of a philosophical question. I'm wondering how your research of the book has affected your thoughts on the sort of question of, when violence is justified in the pursuit of a noble cause.
Right. Well, I mean, the religion thing, he really believed the Appalachian Mountains were put there for him to free the slaves. I mean, he was very, very religious. And I think there was, but, it could even be that, I mean, you can't get inside his head in those hours just after because he very easily took over the town and he had a lot of slaves with him, but in those hours in which he stalled, it's hard to get inside his head except to say that maybe he thought that since this explosion wasn't taking place that he had envisaged, maybe that was, I think he went through almost a kind of conversion in his mind, saying that, well, I'll just have to become the martyr then for this cause rather than the liberator, and maybe this is my destiny. Because when he was in prison, he later did say, his prison letters are full of religious images, and he does say things like that. He says, I've come to realize that now this is my role to be the martyr. And he said, actually, I realized that to hang is the greatest thing that I can do right now is to be hanged from the neck. That's really the greatest, and that's what God has done. So I think that maybe the Nat Turner thing didn't happen, and so he maybe had a kind of religious moment there where he said, I'm going to go this way with it. And in terms of violence, well, I happen to be a 60s pacifist myself. I guess a pansy or something or whatever. I mean, maybe I make my little statements by writing books or whatever. But in terms of kind of fighting people, I've always run the other way. And actually, anyway, it's a very, very, very difficult issue because on the one hand, I detest so much of what is going on in America today. The kind of complacent materialism and the kind of, as I see, a kind of imperialistic, big brother kind of a mentality toward the world. A lot of it wreathed in this kind of self-righteous Christian rhetoric, which to me is very, very hypocritical, and I think it's outrageous what's happening in our prisons. And then no one on top is ready to stand forward and be maybe John Brown and say, I'm going to sacrifice my job for this. I don't believe in this. I happen to be, this is where the buck stops. I'm going to go. This is it. I'm supposedly in command. It's just totally outrageous. Is violence really called for today? I'm not sure. I mean, slavery was such a unique situation when you think about it. And I also mentioned in my book that there were a lot of other social problems, poverty, abortion, all kinds of social issues that were very problematic. But John Brown took up arms against only one of them, and that was slavery. But again, that's a very problematic situation. I guess we have time for
Yeah.
one more, do we? Yeah, one more.
Why no mention of Sanborn, who really stood out more than Thoreau or Emerson in Concord?
Well, Sanborn actually is the one who, I mean, I have a lot on Sanborn in the book, yeah. Sanborn, Franklin Sanborn, was the one who sort of began it all. Because when John Brown came to Boston, Sanborn was the first one that he met, and then Sanborn introduced him to, what do you know much about Sanborn?
Well, I read a lot about history, and I do recall, I think Sanborn had to leave Concord.
Yeah.
And they were trying to hide him because they thought, oh, you're next. You're going with John Brown.
Well, Sanborn was a member of the Secret Six. Sanborn was the member of the, there were 6 supporters of John Brown, so he was a member of the Secret Six, and he burned a lot of his letters because he thought that he might get caught. The only guy that, the Secret Six more or less were quite fearful because they could be imprisoned and maybe even executed because they were supporters of John Brown. And one of them, Garrett Smith, for the rest of his life said, I had nothing to do with John Brown. He had an incredible amount to do with John Brown, and he went in the Utica lunatic asylum for a while because he just was going nuts over. Meanwhile, John Brown was perfectly calm and rational down in prison, but Garrett Smith was in the insane asylum. When he came out, he sued someone for $1.5 million for even suggesting that he had anything to do with John Brown. And meanwhile, he was the chief moneybags for John Brown, the chief financial supporter. And Sanborn was very close. Sanborn was pretty brave, though. He burned the letters, but he didn't quail in the sense that Garrett Smith did. The bravest guy was Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was also Emily Dickinson's supporter and so forth. And Higginson came up and said, "I totally support you. I knew all about this, and I support him." I really admire him for that. He actually stood by John Brown.
Why did he was a nice-looking man, but he never ran for office.
Was that
because
Sanborn?
he was illiterate? No, Brown.
Brown.
I mean, he couldn't write?
Yeah. I mean, some people think he's nice looking. Other people.
Well, with that beard he is.
My wife said. My daughter says, when will you stop writing books about guys with long white beards? Because I also wrote one about this guy over here. And when I saw this jacket design, I told and initially my publisher had made it the same color. I said, "Is this like a series or something?" Please, at least change the color. But no, I mean he wasn't really he didn't believe in the Republican Party whatsoever. He thought that the Republican Party was complicitous in slavery, basically, because anyway, he just didn't believe in the whole political channels, basically. Yeah. Okay, thanks for coming.
Thanks a lot. Discussing your book, and
A writer doing a biography actually at the local news writer.
You should sit here later. You could buy one of the books about
Well,
Muppet.
filmmaker is in Lexington. Come to me to do a shoot. This is a little bit. That's much as
Thank you. Very good. Thank you very much. That's
Yeah, we have to keep.
Yes, we should. Absolutely.
You want to come on over?
Very powerful in your comments. Thanks a lot.
Not many books have been written about you.
No.
So you had
Particularly
Einstein, so you had one that's
Go ahead.
Am I next? In the biography.
Well, I'm just holding you.
You're pushing stuff.
Well, yeah, certainly recently.
And they have this Are you still practicing?
No, you'll see it.
No.
Oh yeah, you can see it. It's interesting. But
Thank you.
This was something
Yes, I know.
brought into the stash.
Sure.
So just when they should sign the papers.
Okay.
It's not bad.
Terrific.
Everybody has their special requests. Some people love it. People do long things.